Hey everyone! Thanks for checking out the first part of my Sega Master System retrospective. If you haven't seen any of my retrospectives before, I go through a console year by year. I point out all the notable games, or if I can, I point out all the games. Like in this case, we're doing that because there's not that many. And yeah, I'm a collector who, I went crazy trying to collect everything at some point and just decided I needed to curate my collection, drill down to what's really important to me, and I started doing these as a way to figure out what games I want to keep in my collection and maybe discover some great games that I didn't know about before. So yeah, I've done a ton of these retrospectives before, worth checking out. Go back and look at some of the other ones. I'm going through the NES stuff right now, but I'm at a pretty big year for a lot of systems, so I thought I'd take a break and do some shorter ones. And so yeah, we're going to do the other 8-bit system. Well, I mean, Atari had one too, but this is the other 8-bit system that's a little more notable. That is the Sega Master System. Technically the third system put out by Sega, but only the first one to come out in North America. Maybe even in outside of Japan. I think those first two were only released in Japan. The Master System I never really played as a kid, but it was a console that I started collecting when I was in kind of my biggest point in my collection. When I was going for full collections, I went for a full Master System US collection. I got pretty close. I think I had close to 100 games. There are 114 games released in North America, but there's like 341 games total for the system, including all regions. There were a lot of games released in Japan only. There were a lot of European-only games. And even Brazil had a pretty big Master System following. They had a ton of exclusive games, or at least new localizations of games based on comics from over there. And the Master System lived on well past any other year in Brazil. It kept going. So crazy to see that. But over here, didn't really do that well. I mean, the NES was just killing it. They had this kind of deal where if you wanted to put games out on the NES, you weren't allowed to put them out anywhere else. That lasted through probably halfway through the Genesis's life cycle. So a ton of games that were exclusive to the NES. But it also means that a lot of stuff on the Master System is also exclusive. Now the problem is that Sega couldn't really rely on third-party publishers, so they had to do all the development and publishing themselves for a lot of those games. So, a lot of Sega stuff on here. Not really a ton of notable stuff this year, but some really interesting titles. We'll get into the notable European titles and even some of the Japanese titles later on in a different video, because I think that stuff is really interesting and really easy to import. You can get a lot of that stuff for pretty cheap, so definitely worth knowing about a bunch of those titles. But for now, we're going to keep these videos to just the North American stuff. If you're a collector or you're not too sure about this stuff, it's actually pretty easy to tell the difference if you can get a box. The North American games only have English on the back of the box and in the manuals, whereas the European games usually have like 5 or 6 languages in both. So a lot of my games, including this one here, is actually a European version. It's just the one I happened to find, so that's the one I have. For me, it's not that big of a deal, but I know some collectors will only want the games specifically from North America. Now, that's kind of tricky because once the boxes are opened, it's almost impossible to tell. And some games, it's a pretty big deal. Like, one of the rarest games in North America is a lot easier to get a European version. So if you find it loose, you don't really know what you got. In North America, the system launched on September of 1986. So not a whole lot of months in the year, but quite a few games still came out in that time. The system is a pretty interesting looking thing if you've never seen one. It's got the cartridge slot like you'd expect. It also has what's called the card slot, which in the Japanese version, this plays old SG-1000 games and maybe games from Sega's second console, the Sega cards. They're just cheaper, smaller cartridges, kind of. They're little thin cards. There weren't a whole lot of games that came out here for them, but that slot is also used for the Sega 3D glasses, which we'll get into next year. The system also had a couple accessories around launch. There was the Sega Phaser, which is a Nintendo Zapper-like light gun. And there was the Sega Sports Pad controller, which were trackballs that had buttons on the side. I think that was similar to some Atari controllers. The Master System released with 2 bundles at launch. One was called the Sega Base System, like this one is called, although this was a newer model that was released later. The original base system came with 2 controllers, RF and AV hookups, the power adapter obviously, and the system itself. I don't think it came with a game. There was also, though, the Sega Master System bundle, which came with all that, plus the phaser gun and a dual cart that included Hang On and Safari Hunt. So let's get right into the games. Given how distribution was back then, we don't have exact dates for any of those games, so this list isn't really in chronological order like a lot of my retrospectives are, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. We know at least the year a lot of this stuff came out. There were 21 games released in North America in 1986, so we'll go through all of those. I broke them up into different categories that I think make sense. And starting off with kind of the 3 launch titles, all of which were included in the Master System bundle. The first game we're going to talk about is actually inside this on the BIOS itself. There was a letter, I believe, that came with the system that told you how to access it, and that's called Snail Maze. Now, this is a pack-in game that was included on most of the Model 1 Master Systems. To play it, you needed to turn on the system when there was no cartridge in it. Then you hold up and buttons 1 and 2 on the controller. The game has a snail moving through 12 mazes, trying to find its way to the exit on each one within the time limit. It's a really interesting thing that was just on there, a small little game to play if you got the base system and didn't have anything else. And the only other thing you really could have was the pack-in for the Master System bundle at launch. So yeah, let's get to that. That was Hang On and Safari Hunt. Hang On was a console conversion of Sega's classic motorbike racer. This port featured 3 difficulty levels and 8 courses with 5 checkpoints each. So if you played one of Sega's old racing games like Outrun or, Hang On or Super Hang On or any of those, it's very much you pick a course and you just try to get to the next checkpoint each time, and your time extends and you just got to get through it. I like the Hang On series. I don't think this is the best version, obviously, but it's still a cool one to check out. Safari Hunt was Sega's take on Duck Hunt. So it's a shooting gallery style game where you hunt animals in 3 different environments. You have 30 bullets in each round, and the levels repeat 23 times as the difficulty increases. So yeah, let's move on to cover all the rest of the release year games from 1986. A lot of this stuff isn't worth checking out. That's why I only have one on the table. I really trimmed down my Master System collection to just the essentials. There's still a lot of good stuff to talk about in the next years. But right now, yeah, not a whole lot of great stuff, but some notable stuff and just some interesting stuff. So, you know what, let's just jump right to the kind of notable exclusive, in my opinion, the game that's worth knowing about for the Master System at its launch year. That is Alex Kidd in Miracle World. Alex Kidd was Sega's first mascot, which most people didn't know about unless they owned a Master System back then. But for kids who did have a Master System, he was basically their Mario. And this was the first of quite a few Master System games that starred him. In the game, Alex Kidd is the lost prince of Redaxian, who was taken away as a kid and is now trying to find his way back to the hidden city. Its ruler, King Thunder, who's also his father, was defeated, and his half-brother, the prince, was taken captive by Jankin the Great. In order to get back to the city, Alex Kidd must find the 5 lost treasures that point the way. The game is a platformer where Alex can jump, punch, and collect money to purchase various items and power-ups. He can also slide, swim, drive a motorbike or helicopter with power-ups, or there's sections where you can pilot a boat. The game features 17 levels with shops, secrets, and power-ups, just a ton of cool stuff. It's a very different game than Mario. A lot more kind of cryptic and interesting. There's a lot going on here. Definitely not as good. It's not as tight. It doesn't play as well. There's a lot of, it's just a very different kind of take on the platformer genre. After that, let's just get into the other kind of console exclusives that the Master System had at the time. Starting with Marksman Shooting and Trap Shooting. This is a collection of 2 games for the Sega Phaser. Marksman Shooting is a military-style shooting range where you shoot at target cutouts that pop up. Trap Shooting is a clay disc shooter, kind of like the clay pigeon game included in NES's Duck Hunt. You shoot at the clay discs that are launched into the game's different backgrounds. Next, we'll get to My Hero. This is a home conversion of Sega's side-scrolling action arcade game. The game has the hero fighting through 3 stages to save his kidnapped girlfriend. While the original arcade game featured ninjas and humanoid ape-type enemies, the Master System version only included the gang members. The game has 3 stages that repeat once completed. Then we get to a cool one, the Ninja. A home conversion of the arcade game Sega Ninja, or in Japan, Ninja Princess. It strips out the female ninja princess protagonist for a generic male ninja, which is a bit of a shame. The game is a top-down action title with 13 stages that feature different scrolling directions, environments, and enemies that add a feeling of variety to the gameplay, which is pretty much the same in all stages. In the game, you move through each level using your shurikens and ninja abilities to take out swarms of incoming enemies. This is a decent one and maybe the only one on this list that I would look into adding back into my collection. Then let's talk about Great Ice Hockey, which is a basic hockey game that's only really notable because it's one of the games that can be played with the Sega Sports Pad. So yeah, an expensive purchase in the launch year to only be able to play this kind of generic hockey game. Another kind of generic sports game after that, Super Tennis. This game featured singles and doubles matches, 5 difficulty levels, and 3 gameplay settings that affected speed, accuracy, and playstyle. Following that, a game that sounds way cooler than it is, Ghost House. A horror-themed action platformer where the main character Mick goes through the ghost house 5 times to take out the vampire in each one. The house is filled with all kinds of monsters and traps. Mick can jump and attack while exploring the house to find various items he needs to get past enemies and kill the vampire. It's a pretty unique game, but it's really not that fun. F-16 Fighting Falcon is next, and this is a first-person air combat simulation game that's a port of the first game in the Falcon series, which was developed by Nexa Corporation for the MSX originally. So I think that's a pretty big flight sim series from back in the day. That's, just interesting that I think this is the only console release of it. I mean, MSX was a Japanese computer, so yeah, this is really the only console release of it. Following that is Astro Warrior, not to be confused with the previous Astro Flash. This is a vertical shoot 'em up with 3 levels and bosses that repeat as the difficulty increases. It looks kind of fun. It looks a lot like another vertical shoot 'em up I can't quite put my name on, so I'm not sure who stole whose graphical style, but yeah, this really is reminiscent of another vertical shooter. I just don't know which right now. Just a kind of decent generic vertical shoot 'em up. Following that, Black Belt, which sounds really generic, but this is actually a localization of Japan's Fist of the North Star game, maybe the first game with that license, which has been, of course, stripped out for the English release. The graphics have been changed. The basic story shows its roots, though, taking place in a post-apocalyptic world where the character Ricky is trying to save his kidnapped girlfriend Kyoko from Wang and his gang. It's a side-scrolling action game with 5 different levels and 7 bosses. Following that, another interesting kind of localization choice, Rambo First Blood Part 2. Now, this is a version of the Japanese game Asura, which has had the Rambo license added to it for its North American release. This is a top-down shooter similar to Commando. The original game starred 2 Buddhist monks who've now been replaced with Rambo and his original second-player sidekick Zane. They shoot their way through 6 levels to clear a path to the concentration camps where their comrades are being held. The last kind of console exclusive of the year is World Grand Prix, a generic Formula 1 style racing game with 12 tracks and an upgrade system where you can use the points you've earned over the races to improve your car. It also features a track editor, so some interesting stuff there. Aside from the exclusive games, Sega did a lot of arcade ports for their machines, and the Master System had a ton of conversions of Sega arcade games. A couple popular ones this year, but a lot of unknown ones, even though they did come out over here. So yeah, let's get through all of the arcade conversions that were available on the Master System during its launch year. So if you haven't played Fantasy Zone before, it is a horizontal shoot 'em up with really cute graphics. I think it's kind of inspired the term cute 'em up. The gameplay is really inspired by something like Defender. In the game, you move left and right around a looping level, trying to take out all the enemy generators around to open a door to the boss battle. This is the first game in the Fantasy Zone series, and it leads to some interesting sequels for the Master System we'll get to in later years. The game introduced the Opa Opa ship, which has become a bit of a minor mascot for Sega, and the game features 7 stages with 6 enemy generators to take out in each, and a final boss. The last stage is a boss rush-like stage where you have to take out all the bosses before you get to the real final boss. And there's also a shop to spend the coins you collect on various power-ups, including 4 new engines, 3 weapons, 3 bomb types, and extra lives. This game is a ton of fun. You can play it in a lot of places. I recommend checking it out if you haven't. And next up, the conversion of maybe the second most popular arcade game this year, though still not that well known, that's Choplifter. This conversion of Sega's horizontal side-scrolling helicopter game has you taking out enemies to rescue captives in the game's 4 levels. Each level is a different setting with 4 camps and a total of 32 hostages. You have to successfully pick up and drop off 20 of them to complete the level. Following that, I'm not quite sure if this is an exclusive or a conversion, but I put it in this section, Pro Wrestling. This has the same name as an NES title, but it is a completely different game. This one is based on Sega's arcade wrestling game called Body Slam, which is notable for its original Japanese release, which featured prominent female wrestlers. This version was criticized for its controls and repetitive gameplay, so that's a bit of a shame. The game lets the player choose one of 4 tag team duos to compete in a tournament against 2 other teams, or you can take on your friend in the 2-player mode. Then a completely obscure arcade game, Teddy Boy. This home conversion of the strange Teddy Boy Blues arcade machine is a game named after a song from a Japanese pop idol. The game features 50 side-scrolling platformer mazes where monster generators that look like dice spawn creatures to attack you. As Teddy Boy, you have to clear the maze of all monsters and collect their orbs within the time limit to move on to the next maze. Then the last arcade conversion of the year, Action Fighter. This is a conversion of Sega's top-down combat driving arcade game that looks like a shameless take on Spy Hunter, but actually has quite a few interesting features that make it worth checking out in its own right. First off, you start as a motorcycle, but you can pick up vehicle parts to transform into a jet or car. Every vehicle has weapons to take out enemy vehicles, and the game includes 5 different missions with bosses, so it's not an endless run kind of thing. Then, an interesting game, not a great one, but interesting, Transbot. Now this is known as Astroflash in Japan, and this is a horizontal shoot-'em-up that was inspired by Transformers. The game takes place in a future where humans have emerged from shelters after a nuclear war and have to fight an out-of-controlled AI. In the game, the player controls a transformable robot that can change between a jet and a mech, it's armed with a standard shot, and there's 5 different limited-use weapons you can pick up. There's only 2 short stages and a boss that repeat indefinitely with increasing difficulty. This is kind of notable because the Famicom and Disk System would get some Transformer games, but this is the closest thing outside of Japan to a Transformers G1 console game that we got until Devastation in 2008, so it became pretty notable as a Master System title, even though it's not great. And lastly, there was one multi-platform game that was released this year. I mean, Fantasy Zone could maybe be considered that because of the unlicensed NES version that came out by Tengen later, but yeah, one for sure, that is a version of Spy vs. Spy. This is a conversion of the original Commodore 64 classic that was based on the Mad Magazine comic strip. Gameplay involves a spy moving through the rooms in a stage to find 5 treasures and escape before the other spy does. Along the way, you can attack your opponent or lay traps for them. The game has 16 different stages and a 2-player mode. Yeah, that's it for this year in 1986. Not a lot of great stuff, but an interesting start for the console. There's some Japanese games, though, that sound pretty interesting that came out this year, so I'm going to get to those in another video, cover them a bit more in depth, because I don't know anything about them right now. And nothing really from Europe yet, so definitely stay tuned for more Master System episodes. Stay tuned for my other retrospectives. I'm doing a whole bunch of stuff. I got to get back to NES soon, and just all kinds of consoles I'm working through right now. Check out my old retrospectives if you haven't, because I cover a lot of stuff. And subscribe and hit that bell to stay notified, because it really helps, me get motivated and do more of these things. Yeah, so I hope you discovered a new game to check out. See you guys next time. Bye.